members of the press, ladies and gentlemen, as a part of the church that takes cognizance of the full worth of the dignity of humanity, that carries the image of God, Imago Dei, Zimbabwe Divine Destiny laments the fact that we are into yet another election with horrendous memories of the public shootings by the military on August 1, 2018. Like in many seasons of darkness that characterize the torrid cycles in which political history, there has not been any resolution on the matter. We all know that ever since the appointment of the Mohlante-led commission, a report was launched by the president himself, but there's never been any attempt to adhere to the report and the recommendations. That in itself punctures a hole in the confidence on this electoral process. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence of shambolic state of the election machinery, ranging from the failure by ZEC to release the voters' roll to those entitled to it, to disenfranchising candidates through dubious disqualifications, let alone the latest breaking into ZEC offices and disappearance of computers, points to a lack of preparedness and seriousness on the part of government to have credible elections. This is a litany of botch-up blips and blunders. This already discredits the elections even before casting of votes. As if that is not enough, the courts, which are supposed to be the last line of defense of all people and sundry, seem to have become more political than the jurisprudence they ought to be. The lines that separate powers for constitutional democracy have been blurred, if not obliterated. Democratic space continues to shrink, and freedoms of other political players are not guaranteed, yet those close to the powers, right, and the ruling party enjoy unfettered freedoms, ranging from holding rallies to music galas. Yet we have witnessed how the opposition has had a number of their rallies blocked. Honest police officers, desirous of holding the law, particularly during this electoral season, get victimized, whilst abusers of the law go scot-free. We all know of Barbara, Rosie, who came out brazenly harassing the police officers as he was actually carrying out his duty. Now, the public media coverage on political activities is blatantly uneven. It's all about ZANU PF, and when the report on the opposition is made, and in particular CCC, it is pathologically evaluative and obnoxiously biased. The heavens are watching. So much money has reportedly exchanged hands in the period with cars donated, and there's no doubt that it is nothing less than bribe. Psalm number 50 verse 21 says, "You have done all these and I kept quiet, so you thought I am like you." That is what the Bible says. We also ask the clergy, is our conscience clean? Now we have witnessed President Mnangagwa going in churches, pontificating, purporting to be praying. And we have seen and witnessed him leaving large sums of money into, offertory bags. A dog with a bone in its mouth will not bark. And to the general citizenry who will benefit from these dirty lages, are you being responsible citizen? Does this move the nation forward? Exodus chapter number 23 verse 8 further says, a bribe blinds the sighted and subverts the cause of the just. The bottom line is, unless the fear of God reigns supreme in all echelons of power and in the generality of our people, this nation may not come out of this prolonged, endless quagmire. Galatians 6 verse 7 notes, God is not mocked. Whatsoever you sow, so shall you reap. Unfortunately, irresponsible leaders are dragging innocent Zimbabweans along with them into the endless, prolonged sufferings. Now, as the church, we demand the following. Number one, that President Mnangagwa's talk on peace be translated into action, right? Forcing people to attend rallies, including frog marching villagers to meetings against their choice, is not peace. This does not augur well with peace. We have been in rural areas and we've witnessed people confessing that they are tired of being forced to attend rallies every day. This must stop. Number two, that the public media coverage on political activities be fair. And number three, that the judiciary be just in their ruling, knowing that also they will stand before the judge of judges.
An electoral environment is a broad term that can refer to a number of different things. In general, it can refer to an overall political climate leading up to an election, including the campaigns, political issues, candidates involved. It can also refer to the specific policies, laws, and regulations that govern the conduct of elections, and it has a significant impact on the outcome of the elections. Moving on, the youth perspective on the electoral environment in Zimbabwe is shaped by a number of factors, including their experiences with previous elections, their understanding of democracy, and their aspirations for the future of the country. Many young people in Zimbabwe are concerned about the fairness and transparency of the electoral process and feel that their voices are not being heard. They also feel that the political system is dominated by older, more established politicians, and there are not enough opportunities for young people to participate in the political process. It's safe to say that the youth population has a unique perspective on the electoral environment, but most importantly, you are mainly concerned on the operations of the electoral system, if it's accountable to hold free and fair elections, and the youth in many occasions base their judgments from their perspectives on the political environment. The main thrust of this presentation, therefore, is going to be centered around the youth perspective on the electoral environment, highlighting recommendations ahead of the 2023 pause. So, I'll start by giving you some of the issues which are going to be discussed in the below presentation. The first issue, or my first point, is the youth perceive the electoral environment as an opportunity for them to engage in the electoral process and to strengthen their social capital networks. Number two, election environment is viewed as an oppressive and suppressive. in Zimbabwe. Number 3, election environment in Zimbabwe is very, very violent. And the last one, the issue of fairness and freeness in the electoral period. Youth in Zimbabwe nowadays perceive the election period and the electoral environment as an opportunity for them to strengthen their social network. They start engaging with the candidates and other political officials and advance their agenda. In such thoughts, some youths become optimistic about the chances that come to them, regardless of the other consequences, like exposing themselves to danger from revolting citizens. Due to technological advancements, the youth have moved from the traditional means of acquiring information to digital ways, and by doing so, they are now more advanced in terms of understanding and interpreting the electoral system and enlarge their political views. Moving on, the youth also perceive the electoral environment as oppressive and suppressive in as much as freedom of expression is concerned. This is manifesting through the continuing arrest of youth who are viewed as opposition projects. This therefore denies the youth their full will and their full right to participate in the democratic space. The oppressive electoral environment is also seen through the suppression of the opposition candidates who were barred to contest in the upcoming elections, 12 CCC, Blawa MPs, and Xavier Kasukuwere as well. In addition, it is of no doubt to say that the youth views electoral environment as violent and unfavorable, mostly to those who oppose the ruling party. Both pre- and post-election periods during previous elections have consistently featured main incidents of violence and intimidation, including casualties. Further clashes with security forces, opposing rival activists, and other forms of political violence and intimidation are possible during the post-election period, and they are already manifesting ahead of polls, whereby opposition members suffer from torture, harassment, and intimidation. Furthermore, the electoral environment is unfair and not free. The arrests and convictions of opposition figures and government critics has intensified since February 2023. The electoral reforms the opposition have demanded for years to level the playing field, provide access to media, and remove ex-military personnel from the electoral board have not happened. Also, the refusal by ZEC to provide the voters' roll raised suspicions of holding incredible and unfair elections. So here I will conclude by giving some recommendations. My first recommendation is electoral reforms. The second one is increased transparency. The third one is increased civic education. The fourth one is accountability. Those who are responsible for certain actions should be held accountable for their actions. The fifth one is protection of voters and election officials. Then the sixth one is it is important to provide adequate resources for elections, including funding, personnel, and equipment.
The Women's Academy for Leadership and Political Excellence, WALPE, is deeply concerned with the electoral environment preceding the 23 August 2023 harmonized elections. Women's rights organizations, WALPE included, advocated for electoral reforms since 2018 that promote free, active, and full participation of women in democratic processes as both candidates and voters. But to date, none of the reforms were implemented. Top on the reform list was the full alignment of Sections 17, 56, and 80 of the Constitution with the Electoral Act in order to empower the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission to reject political party lists that during the nomination process that are not gender balanced. The implications of this have already been felt, where the number of women contesting as members of parliament declined from 237 women out of 1,648 candidates in 2018 to 70 women out of 637 candidates contesting in 2023. The percentage declined from 14% to 11%. Now, if the Supreme Court upholds the High Court judgment to disqualify 12 Citizens Coalition for Change, that is CCC, aspiring MPs from Bulawayo from contesting on the 23rd of August elections, the number of women contesting will decline to 66, which is 10%, and the number is expected to decline further after the announcement of the election results. Political violence, both covert and overt, remains one of the major hindrances to women's full participation in elections, and women are exposed to political violence in different forms, such as election administrators, voters, candidates, and intimate partners of male political leaders. Since January 2023 to date, WALP has recorded many cases of human rights violations against women, and these include threats of violence, online shaming, sexual harassment, assault, arbitrary arrest, revenge pornography, body shaming, and forced migration. And these cases of violence against women varied from intra-party to inter-party and state-sponsored violence. Zimbabwe in 2018 had a record number of 4 women contesting as presidential candidates, but in 2023 only 1 woman made it to the ballot, and this was after the intervention of the courts. The lower numbers of women have been reported at council, parliament, and presidential levels, and the steep nomination fees introduced by the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission in 2022 blocked many deserving female aspiring leaders from successfully lodging their papers at the nomination courts. The fees were pegged at 1,000 for the MPs, 20,000 for the presidential candidates. This is way beyond the reach of many Zimbabweans and not a true reflection of the struggling economy that we have. Women aspiring leaders' media coverage remains low ahead of the elections. Where the women leaders are covered, it is usually in the negative, and in most instances, it is a scandal or how badly dressed they are. Civic and voter education targeting women, young women, and women with disabilities has not been widespread. Women are the majority of the 6,619,690 registered voters, and it is prudent that voter education be prioritized among this population. Zimbabwe Electoral Commission is yet to accredit civil society organizations to conduct civic education 3 weeks before the elections, and civil society organizations were only accredited a few days ago as local observers, which limits their work during the elections. As such, as WALPE would recommend that in order to guarantee gender balance in all public and elected positions, Zimbabwe must urgently consider changing the electoral voting system from first past the post to proportional representation, closed zebra system. Secondly, we urge ZEC to urgently accredit civil society organizations that have not been accredited to conduct civic and voter education. Thirdly, media houses dedicate space for women aspiring leaders to present their election roadmaps and manifestos, regardless of which political party they are affiliated with. Fourthly, the government must fully align Section 17, 56, and 80 of the Constitution with the Electoral Act in order to promote gender parity. And lastly, the government, political parties, and the police must do all within their power to protect women from all forms of political violence and make sure perpetrators are punished. Thank you.
This press conference is part of our duty as patriotic citizens in taking stock of the continuing journey towards making our country's democracy work, and in particular making our elections, which are an important part of that democracy, meaningful. Importantly, the press conference has also been informed by events obtaining on the ground and the imperative need for us as pro-democracy forces to give our assessment and recommendations regarding the prevailing environment ahead of the 2023 polls. Allow me through these remarks to highlight the Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition's assessment and position on the 2023 harmonized elections. To do this, I will give a measured assessment of the electoral playing field, drawing from key benchmarks which are our Constitution, the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, as well as the SADC principles and guidelines governing democratic elections. I will also briefly give a history of why we find ourselves as a country in this conjuncture. In conclusion, I will also lay out our recommendations in the interest of improving our democratic processes in pursuit of genuine and inclusive development in Zimbabwe. The hub of our interest is the Zimbabwean dream, the realization of the promise of 1980, that of prosperity, equality, peace, and happiness for all who call this land home. The supreme right of self-determination and the right of ordinary citizens to define and determine the trajectory of their country through free and fair elections. Our assessment on the credibility of the 2023 polls is as follows. With 20 days to go to the 2023 polls, a lot of questions linger in the minds of many. One, does the pre-electoral environment guarantee free, fair, and credible polls? Two, is the ordinary voter guaranteed the right to freely participate and vote without coercion? Do they have the power to freely influence the country's governance processes? Three, is the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission up to the task as provided for by the Constitution of Zimbabwe? Four, are state institutions impartial? What has been the conduct of the police force? What has been the conduct of our intelligence services, among other state institutions? Five, what is the status and role of women and youth and their space in this election? Six, will the cumulative will of the people prevail on the morning after 23 August? These are the questions we are discussing today. We make this statement knowing very well the sad reality that ordinary Zimbabweans are not free to speak out on these very fundamental questions. They are choked by a coterie of obnoxious and unconstitutional pieces of legislations intended to silence them into submission like sheep to slaughter. However, unfortunately, the Constitution of Zimbabwe guides us on this matter. We defy and will not be silenced. Indeed, we encourage all Zimbabweans to defy and abhor all patently unjust and unconstitutional laws. This is not Rhodesia, this is Zimbabwe. We have been able to track various facets that constitute a credible election based on a compound assessment of various key documents as mentioned earlier, the Constitution, the African Charter, as well as the SADC principles and guidelines. To begin with, we'll focus on the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. Our humble assessment, shared by many, is that the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission has failed to inspire confidence as an institution ready to manage free and fair elections. And the evidence is overwhelming. ZEC has failed to produce a credible voters' roll on time. It continues to duck recommendations, including from SADC and AU, to subject the voters' roll to an independent audit. Already many irregularities have been unearthed, with the voters' roll giving every reason to believe that it is definitely going to be another tool in the manipulation of elections. The election is to be conducted on the back of a flawed delimitation process which failed the constitutional test, again a result of the incompetence and the negligence of ZEC. All pointers are that the delimitation process was an exercise of gerrymandering, with the ZEC a willing accomplice of ZANU PF, the instigator and beneficiary of the flawed process. ZEC and ZANU PF seem to be in a relationship to subvert the constitution and the will of the people of Zimbabwe. The presence of close family members of ZANU PF's political elites in ZEC is problematic using any corporate governance measure. These families are represented in ZEC. The following families, just for the avoidance of doubt, these families are in ZEC. We have one, ZANU PF Vice President Simohadi's family is in ZEC. ZANU PF's Secretary General Obed Mpov's family is in ZEC. Secretary for Information Mangwana's family, as well as the Minister of Foreign Affairs Shava's family. They are all part of our electoral governing board, ZEC. So this is scandalous and gross political insults. Do these people represent Zimbabwe or ZANU PF? Do they represent the interests of the collective or the interests of a particular group, in this case ZANU PF? This is a clear case of capture and the preservation of certain family interests. And unfortunately, that's unacceptable, and we cannot accept that. The current state, where even the ZEC itself was found to have wrongly managed the nomination process, also complicates the situation. We are all aware that the judiciary has already ruled that the ZEC failed to manage the nomination process. So this also complicates the situation. We go to the issue of the courts and the mechanisms for redress of electoral grievances. The courts have of late usurped the right of citizens to determine their leaders through voting. And what is emerging is a rather worrisome trend where the courts will determine who can contest and who cannot contest in this election. In the case of Linda Masarira, Xavier Kasukuwere, and the triple C 12 in Blawayo are all reflective of a judiciary that has indeed gone wrong. I will return to this issue later. The judiciary must protect the vote by allowing Zimbabweans to use their vote to elect a government of their choice. Peace and progress are guaranteed by the vote and not judgments issued by compromised officers. We also discussed the issue of the abuse of state-controlled media. The capture of state-controlled media is becoming an unaccepted reality in the country for many citizens. We have started to normalize that it's normal for the state media to act in such a manner, so biased manner. Fortunately, the alternative media is somewhat filled this gap, especially in correcting the deliberate misinformation and disinformation spewed by the public broadcaster. A casual look at the last month's coverage shows that around a reportage of 87% from state media was pro-ruling party. It was all pro-ZANU PF. Only 13% was shared by the political opposition. And usually this 13% is usually in a negative way, where the opposition is being attacked by the public broadcaster. Then we go to the issue of a code of conduct for electoral stakeholders. ZEC has failed to facilitate the authoring of an electoral code of conduct to guide the conduct of all stakeholders key to the credibility of this election. This has meant that it cannot rein in the gross misconduct by actors such as Zimbabwe Republic Police, ZRP, the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation, ZBC, the Central Intelligence Organization, through the discredited Forever Associates Zimbabwe FAZ, and non-government and ZANU PF officials who incite violence against citizens on a daily basis. Without a functional and enforceable code of conduct, ZEC knows it is not compelled to play its oversight role over their actions. Yet this is exactly why ZEC exists, to create conditions for a credible election. Our verdict and why history matters. It is our humble but firm view as Zimbabweans that the credibility of the 2023 elections has been dealt a huge blow by the above-mentioned acts of both commission and omission, by the very actors that are supposed to help guarantee the credibility and legitimacy of elections, including ZEC, ZRP, intelligence services, the judiciary, and the executive, among others. The unresolved historical prevailing political environment and the skewed electoral framework, which has clearly deteriorated since 2018, essentially means that the electoral environment for the 2023 elections will be worse than what prevailed in 2018, completely rendering this a sham election, neither free nor fair nor credible. Many scholars and historians have always warned how Zimbabwe has had a history of disputed elections since the very first elections that gave birth to the country's independence in 1980. ZANU PF has constantly been accused of various electoral malpractices to attain and retain incumbents. A number of worrisome and retrogressive practices have been allowed over time to eat at the core of our state institutions, which under normal circumstances are supposed to support democracy. These have been captured and frozen. Present-day Zimbabwe is captured by an economic cartel composed of a few seemingly untouchable political elites whose interest is the capture and perpetuation of the grip of power. This is not for the benefit of all Zimbabweans, but for narrow political and economic interests for a few. However, none is a worrying and damaging for our democracy and the credibility of our elections and democratic processes is what we have seen with the judiciary. This capture of the judiciary is as dangerous and worrying as much as it is scandalous. Ladies and gentlemen, the capture and negation of the judiciary is dangerous and a recipe for instability and a repeat of another coup. The fate of the judiciary was apparently sealed through a forced and unconstitutional amendment number 2 of 2021. This essentially transferred all judiciary powers to the president, and the political activism by the Zimbabwean bench we see today emanates from this particular constitutional amendment, whose enactment is to a great extent the day that the Zimbabwean judiciary was killed. The globally celebrated separation of powers between the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature, and even the media does no longer exist here in Zimbabwe. Ours is now a de facto one-party state. The series of very partisan judgments and spate of injustice drain any possible confidence in our judiciary, with the office of the Chief Justice as the most compromised. The unjustified incarceration of opposition figure Job Scala, Jacob Ngarivume, the Mtakwas 11 affirms our assertion. One wonders whether it is the same judiciary that is so quick to declare freedom to ZANU PF leaders often fingered in brazen corruption cases. And the cases of corruption are pardoned. The cases of corruption that are pardoned are too many to mention. You can think of the drugs scandal, or the COVID gate, the NASA gate, the gold mafia, the Pomona gate. The list is endless. It is clear that some judicial officers have accepted houses and a few United States dollars to undo and threaten the birthright of all Zimbabweans, born of the blood and sacrifices of thousands during the liberation struggle. For surely, how can a mere mortal negate the principle of one man, one vote with a straight conscience? These judicial officers are also acting as accessories of those that are looting the state dry by failing to exercise due diligence in the prosecution of perpetrators of economic crimes. History did judge these accessories of pseudo and counter-revolutionaries harshly. We are not partisan as civil society. Our point is simple. Let Zimbabweans vote freely and fairly, and whoever wins, good for Zimbabwe. That is our simple point. The coup of November 2017 has not ended. The infrastructure of violence is still ubiquitous across Zimbabwe. We call this the margin of terror. Victims of various episodes of violence like Gukura Hundi, 1983 to 87, Chimwenje, 1990-1995, Muramba Tsvina, 2005, and the post-2000 series, including 2002, 2008, and 2018, they are still yet to be compensated. Millions of Zimbabweans are in exile, political and economic exile in Africa, Europe, America, and the Pacific. These are running away from a rich country which has been collapsed by a comprado bourgeois class using its relations with hostile foreign cartels to strip Zimbabwe of gold, diamonds, platinum, lithium in return for support for power retention. Political coups are cured through dialogue. Sadly, Zimbabweans have not been talking. What we see even in this election is a filthy display of mightiness through trinkets like t-shirts, loaves of bread, a few pieces of meat for the masses, and cars and houses for the elites, all in pursuit of what they call a clean sweep. How can such a rich jewel of Africa, Zimbabwe, justify having a few rich people and collapse the infrastructure like public health, education, roads, very poor wages for its workforce? What is said is that Zimbabwe has received numerous pieces of advice through recommendations of local and African Union and SADC regional and international level observer missions. The government of Zimbabwe has remained averse to progressive reforms, and its preoccupation has been on further closing the civic and democratic space towards a one-party state. The outcome of the impending elections is likely to entrench Zimbabwe's status as a pariah state and result in retarded sustainable economic development and growth, and ultimately worsen the legitimacy and socio-economic condition of the ordinary Zimbabweans, especially women, children, civil servants, people with disabilities, and the aged. This leads us to the most crucial part of this press conference. Where to Zimbabwe? What is the way forward? Zimbabweans are not free. Our former vice president and once leader of the opposition, ZAP, Dr. Joshua Mkwapgongo Nyongolongomo, made an assessment in 1984. The assessment remains true 39 years later. He said, I quote, "The people of Zimbabwe live in fear, not of enemies, but their own government." For ZANU PF spokesperson, our national hero, a crucial former ZANU PF spokesperson, our national hero, a crucial figure in the founding of present-day Zimbabwe, Dr. Edson Zobo, teaches us again when in 1979 he said, "How can an election be said to be free and fair when all its corners is surrounded by the regime's henchmen?" Our view, it is our humble but firm view as Zimbabweans that the credibility of the 2023 elections has been dealt a huge blow by the unresolved historical prevailing political environment and skewed electoral framework, which is worse than the conditions that were prevailing during the 2018 elections. Zimbabweans are not free. Sorry for that. I think there was a mix up a bit. Sorry for that. There is a page that was captured twice. Sorry, my sincere apologies. What is said is that Zimbabwe has received okay. Our session that the Zimbabwean election is not going to be free and fair. Yeah, there is a serious mix-up. It's supported by main factors, including what I raised, the amendment of the Constitution, particularly Amendment number 2 of 2021. Secondly, the enactment of repressive laws, notably the Amendments of Peace and Order Act, the MOP of 2019, the Cyber and Data Protection Act, PVO Bill. Now we have some draconian pieces of legislation under the patriotic laws. The partisan conduct of the Electoral Management Board, increased weaponization of the law against perceived ruling party opponents, abuse of the judiciary, failure to guarantee access to the media, among the whole list that we listed earlier. But on the way forward, I'll quickly jump to the way forward. Our recommendation is that Zimbabwe requires support of the region and the international community to address its numerous challenges through a process of national dialogue. Dialogue must help the country to retain to norm compliance on democratic governance and resolving the question of political legitimacy. It remains our strongest belief that without a substantive national dialogue towards meaningful and sustainable reform supported by the region and international partners, elections under the current context firmly puts the country on a recurring cycle of contested legitimacy, which potentially continues to retard Zimbabwe's prospects for recovery, economic and democratic development. Essentially, Zimbabwe requires the assistance of the region and other international stakeholders to begin a process of inclusive national dialogue among stakeholders, including political parties, civil society, and business, towards sustainable reforms that can retain Zimbabwe to norm compliance with the democratic governance. More importantly, SADC and the AU must be alive to the fact that postponing to deal with the Zimbabwean crisis is the potential to have a spin-off effects at regional level. The coalition continues to call upon various stakeholders, including developmental partners, to support and strengthen civil society responses to the deteriorating human security situation, especially targeted at human rights defenders within its rank and file, as well as broader civil society. Thirdly, the independence and impartiality of ZEC is critical for elections in Zimbabwe. ZEC must act within the provisions of the Constitution of Zimbabwe and as read with SADC principles and guidelines of credible polls in the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. Law enforcement and state security agents must cease from operating as vigilante extensions of the ruling party and must treat all political contestants fairly and in accordance with the set legal provisions. Equally, the army must stay out of politics and elections. We also implore traditional leaders to desist from partisan politics and uphold the Constitution of Zimbabwe. Fifth, the state-controlled media must give equal and fair coverage for all political contestants as provided for by the law. And lastly, the The coalition continues to urge citizens through their own agents to continuously work towards ensuring mechanisms for protecting citizens against undue coercion on election day, and will support in any way possible such efforts to ensure the integrity of the poll is protected on election day. We thank you. Position of Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition, we have been pursuing the government of Emmerson Mnangagwa, asking them to implement the Moshande Commission recommendations. And the government of Mnangagwa, like you are saying, has been dragging its feet. They don't seem to be keen to implement those recommendations. The issue of compensation is very urgent and must be pushed through. We will continue to engage with some of the victims who are in touch with, because if the government is not willing, pursuing the litigation route will remain on the table, and also other options of applying political pressure. But indeed, the government of Emmerson Mnangagwa seems not keen enough to implement the recommendations as stated by the Moshande Commission. But also the issue of observations of elections and our recommendations that remain on the table, that remain on our pieces of paper. We have to understand that we are dealing with a government which is committed to retain power through dirty means. They are a competent authoritarian regime that has a clear track record of not respecting the law, the constitution. This is not a surprise when Emmerson Mnangagwa disregards our recommendations, but the task is not only for us to continue making more recommendations, but to build people power among the collective of all the citizens, so that we can collectively demand the implementation of these recommendations. Unfortunately, the agents of all people seem to be winning over years, but we still believe we are doing a lot of work to get back to our communities, to build the agents, so that collectively we can push for reforms, democratic reforms in our Zimbabwe. We are still confident that we can push for democratic change in Zimbabwe. There is possibility of a transition, but like we also emphasize, there is need for national dialogue, because Zimbabwe things stand today. We cannot have a breakthrough until we bring all partners to the table to dialogue around why we are stuck in this space where we are stuck in as a people. Then we find a way forward. But that dialogue has to be forced by the people, has to be forced from below, so that the leaders can agree to come to the table.